So one of the major challenges is that when it comes to being a UX writer, 20% is writing, 20% of your job is writing, 80% is socializing your craft, arguing with different teams why that copy is in there. So it's a very different experience as a UX writer. I mean, you're constantly justifying your work. You're justifying your work to product managers, you're justifying your work to legal and compliance, you're justifying your work to the business team. But that's the life of a UX copywriter, where 80% of the time you're doing a lot of things. Out of that 80%, you're probably spending 60% arguing why you put that copy in the first place. And it's the whole, if I had to summarize it, it's the art of saying no. And it's not easy.
Hi, I'm here with Ayush today. Ayush, would you like to just kick things off by introducing yourself?
Hi, my name is Ayush Sengupta. I'm a UX writer. I work at TD Bank currently, but previously I worked as a marketing communications manager. I worked as a copywriter. I worked as a content strategist. I worked as an instructional designer at the outset of my career. I've done so many things, but everything's been tied in with writing of some sort. And even today, I'm writing for a bank. And yeah, that's probably the only thing that I know how to do. That is write and crack jokes. I've tried my hand at these amateur open mic nights as well back in India. And it's something that I've really enjoyed because people think of themselves, a lot of people think that they're funny and they as well may be really funny. But when you do that on stage, it is so tough. It's so embarrassing. It almost feels like you're on the stage. You walked in wearing your clothes, but now you're naked on stage and everyone's just looking at you and they aren't even laughing. That's the worst part of it. How my day usually looks like is I wake up in the morning. I leave out all the gory details. And when I get to work as a UX writer, it's something that a lot of people must be wondering what a UX writer does and how does a UX writer really differ. I'm just getting right into it. I know it's an intro. I'm supposed to talk about myself, but I find this subject so fascinating. And I don't like talking about myself because sometimes it comes across as
Join
a
the
bit
club.
pompous. Yeah.
I think
But
every talk I've had so far, I
yeah,
just quickly jump right into the person that I'm talking to because I find them interesting and fascinating. So
yeah.
I don't even introduce myself. I just get right into it.
In my case, I'm boring, so there's not much to talk about. But something that people keep asking me is what is UX writing? What is content design, right? How does it differ from basic copywriting? So it's pretty similar in the sense that you have a brief, there's a problem, and you come up with copy to solve it. But with UX writing, what you essentially do is everything is design based. You have a wireframe design that you look at. The copy is supposed to fit into that design, and a copy is supposed to fit into design. That does not mean that the copy that you write is absolutely mindless. You're trying to fit in design. It's half baked, nothing of that sort. It's just that with UX writing, right? There's a framework of sorts that the UX designer creates for you, and you write within that framework. This is so tied in with the design that you cannot for even 1 sec write something or think of something where things don't tie in with design. That's how closely tied to visual design or to user experience design this is.
Yeah. No, thank you for also introducing like the topic because I think for whoever's listening, content design is something that's very critical to our work.
Yeah.
And this is actually the first content designer we have, I think, overall, like on the series. So excited to chat with you and get to learn a little bit more about your work and how you got into it. Could you talk a little bit more about how you actually got into UX writing and content design?
So UX writing and content design happened by chance. There was this really large insurance giant back in India. When I worked for this company called Cognizant, a lot of people know about Cognizant, so I'm not going to spend time talking about Cognizant. And the division of Cognizant that I was working for, we hadn't worked on any project that was end to end, a UX driven solution. And when the client, they came to us, right, we thought it was a great sort of project for us. And we got into it. And at that point, I realized what UX writing was all about. I had absolutely no clue. I only knew about the world of long form content, short form copy. But in this case, we didn't have a lot of data to begin with. We went to different cities, we spoke to customers on the ground, and we did a lot of research before we wrote what we did. And that told me all about UX writing and ideally how UX writing should be. But that's how I got into the world of UX writing. It was by chance, but it was something that taught me a lot in about, I don't know, maybe 9 months. Painful, but it taught me a lot.
That's amazing. I think when we were last chatting, I remember you mentioning that, like, through that field research, you had
Yeah.
discovered people's comments were more so related to like the tone of things, which is really interesting
Yeah.
because I feel like that's something so rare that you come across through field
Yeah.
research. Could you chat about that a little bit more?
So when we visited these, what we call in India, right? We call them tier two, tier three cities. These are, if in Canada, a tier two city would probably be a Winnipeg or a Saskatoon. That would be a tier two city. And we went to these cities and we were all gung ho. I went with my lead UX designer because the third party marketing company that was supposed to do this, they dropped the ball. And we just got up one day, my lead UX designer and I, and we're like, do you want to do this? Because this is taking a lot of time. And he's like, why not? We went and spoke to people on the ground. And what sort of blew our minds was we tried A/B testing with copy, with design, we tried card sorting. We did a lot of these things. And what we found out was they didn't really care about the digital experience much because as an insurance company, what really bothered them was number one was they really wanted terms and conditions to be upfront. They're like, when we open a web page, we should know in about 3 sentences, we should know what the entire policy is about. We should know how to raise a claim. And that's about it. We don't care. Like we came up, I also came up with something called this sort of, I won't call it a mood board, but it was this word board of sorts that had a word cloud, had different words. And one of the words that I had in there was death. And people didn't have a problem with it. 60, 70% people, they didn't have a problem with the word death. They were like, yeah, we are buying life insurance. We're buying cancer insurance. So why should we have a problem with the word death?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think this is a good takeaway because you found an opportunity and you were able to get right into it and solve for it. You went from, I think, like having like a broad sense of experience. It was almost like
Yep.
honing in on like your T and like your focus and getting into content design. So that seemed to start your journey from there. So you mentioned that you were working at Cognizant in India. And
Yep.
now you're working at TD in Canada. Can you tell us about that transition and how that was for you?
Oh, the transition was huge, but it was also, for some reason, it was seamless because we're this stage of life, my wife and I, we decided that we wanted to experience something new. We wanted to challenge ourselves. And we got a permanent residency when we were in India back in, I think, 2018. And when we were moving in 2019, I reached out to this guy. I'm calling him Guy right now because I didn't know him back then. And he's my
Mhm.
manager currently. And we got chatting on LinkedIn and we realized our interests are quite similar. He understood that I have this understanding of UX writing. But obviously, it is too premature for him to decide whether I'm the right fit or not. So he messages me one day and he's like, can you come in for an interview? I'm like, I'm in India. And I thought you're in Toronto. And I'm like, no, I'm not in Toronto. I'm here in India still. It's going to take me a couple of weeks to move to Canada. And my sister-in-law, she's getting married and I'm going to be in Canada in the next couple of weeks. So he's just reach out once you get here. I'm like, okay, fine. So after I got here, I was jet lagged for 4 or 5 days. After that, I reached out and he was busy for the first 4 or 5. So that was what, 10 days gone. And then suddenly one day, can you come meet me tomorrow? So I go and meet him. We get chatting. He realizes that I know this line of work pretty well, despite having just worked on one
Mhm.
project till day. And he said to me, this could take some time. Our processes, they take time. And I'm like, yeah, that's fine. I'm just like about 11 days old. In Canada, that's fine. About 24 hours later, HR calls me, says that we want you to meet his managers. And I said, how soon? Like tomorrow? I'm like, okay. So I met them the very next day. That was day 13 after I landed. And the very next day, HR reached out to me and said, you have the job. Yeah, let's discuss financials. And I'm like, wow, 2 weeks in Canada and I have a job.
I love that story.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how that all played out and
Yeah.
it happened so fast. So that I think
Yeah.
that's amazing. And
Mm.
um, you talked a little bit about challenges. Can you talk a little bit more about some of, you'd say, like the major challenges that you had?
So one of the major challenges that I recognized is that when you're a copywriter, you're a content, about 80% of your job is writing. 20% is dealing with other things in the corporate world. When it comes to being a UX writer, 20% is writing, 20% of your job is writing. 80% is socializing your craft, arguing with different teams why that copy is in there. So it's a very different experience as a UX writer. I mean, you're constantly justifying your work. You're justifying your work to product managers. You're justifying your work to legal and compliance. You're justifying your work to the business team. You're constantly at loggerheads with dev and QA because they want to see copy decks in a certain way. They want access to information that you may not have access to. But that's the life of a UX copywriter, where 80% of the time you're doing a lot of things. Out of that 80%, you're probably spending 60% arguing why you put that copy in the first place. And it's the whole, if I had to summarize it, it's the art of saying no. And it's not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this, what you mentioned about
Yeah.
socializing your craft. What do you mean
Yeah.
by that?
So it's a difficult thing to explain, but if I had to articulate it, we're at that stage when it comes to the design discipline. UX designers are accepted wholeheartedly. You have a seat at the table. You guys are an important part of the design process. UX writers, on the other hand, we're an important part for sure, but probably a handful of people, a handful of teams acknowledge that. The rest, they think of us as an hindrance of sorts, because there's this attitude when you start on a project that a lot of people have, that it's writing after all. All of us can write. And that's where the disconnect happens. And you have to explain each time why you're there in the first place. Most people appreciate what you've done at the end of a project, but during that entire phase of a project, you're in this fight with Thanos, right? You're probably Captain America. You're really strong, but Thanos is Thanos. A single
Yes.
snap of his fingers, and you know what happens. Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, that's such a clever way to put it. And I was just thinking as you're talking about like the socializing aspect and advocating for your craft. How do you master your craft? Like how do you master content design? Because this was something that you found as an opportunity and then you started working on that. But how did you get good at it?
One of the first things that you do as a content designer, and again, I'm not being preachy here, is get people on board with your ideas. One thing that we writers tend to do, writers have this habit of working in isolation because that's how we have worked for so long.
Mm-hmm.
But with content design, if you're going to work in isolation, it's going to be so difficult for you to get ahead because you're working, like I said, with product managers, business analysts, and for them to see why the copy that you have in your copy deck is there is very important. The business analysts, the product managers, business, they understand the product better than you do. So if you have that attitude that I know better than you and this is how you should position it, that's where you're going to lose that battle. So you have to get them on board. And like I said, 20% is writing. There's absolutely no way they're going to be better at that thing, better at writing than you are going to be. But the remaining 80% is going to take a lot of time to master, such as life. Let it be. Pick your battles, choose your battles. I think a lot of people, they handle these kind of politics better than I do. I'm pretty bad at it. Once you
Right.
have them on board, you sort of start mastering content design that way. The craft itself, you're going to learn with experience, but because you're going to work on different types of projects, right? It could be
Yeah.
regulatory projects where legal and compliance, they're going to drive everything. Yeah, that 20% of writing that I'm talking about is probably going to come down to 5%. Yeah.
It's challenging. And I think it's also because the field is also nuanced. And I think in
Yeah.
the area that you're working in specifically, it's financial. And
Yeah.
you have to be very careful because you're dealing with a lot of legal issues.
Yeah.
And because I've also worked with like content designers previously in the financial field. So I know how tricky that can be. It's not
Yeah.
as easy as you said of just writing your own content in and
No,
it'll
you
be
can't.
fine.
No.
So I respect the, the work that content designers put in. So you talked about getting a seat at the table and how
Yeah.
sometimes that can be like hard as a
Yeah.
content designer. Can you share a little bit of a different perspective on that? I think we briefly like touched on it when we first interacted about like the diversity and
Yeah.
how has that impacted I think your overall experience, especially after moving to Canada and working here.
Before we jump into that, right? If you don't mind, now the seat at the table, right? There are two things here, right? One is a seat at the table as a brown person, right? As a writer who's brown, and the second is seat at the table as a content designer. I think these are slightly different topics in the sense that a seat at the table as a content designer, you can get a seat at the table if you're involved from the word go. And one of the things that you can do, except obviously getting people in on things, is also content designers. If you have a knowledge of the process, right? If you're working in the tech space, it's great if you know how to use Jira, for example, how bugs work, how Scrum calls work, you know how these ceremonies work. You understand what are technical limitations, right? If you worked at a particular place for 2 years, and if you know that these are the sort of technical limitations that are going to come and affect the project, you call that out when you're working with your UX designer at the outset. Once you do these kind of things, except obviously getting everyone
Yeah.
in on your ideas, it really helps to sort of cement the fact that they know what you're doing. With content designers, a lot of times, I think they feel they don't know what you're doing. Most content designers,
Right.
they know what they're doing, but everyone else needs to know that you know what you're doing, right? So for people to take you seriously. Now, the other part, right, where there's diversity, now that is going to take some sort of, I'm not saying tectonic shift, but it's something that people have started noticing where most content designers, I would say about 80, 85% content designers they don't look like me. a very simple way of putting it. Because traditionally, writers in this part of the world, right, they come from a different background than I do. Their ethnicity is different from my ethnicity. And this is something that's being addressed by many people and generally by people, say, white, that they're actually talking about it. And, I can see things changing, but this is definitely going to take some time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's something that I've noticed, and I think
Yeah.
it's good to bring that up and remind
Yeah.
people. I think you mentioned a couple interesting points on getting a seat at getting a seat at the table. And I think one of the things you mentioned was other people not knowing what you're doing or what you're
Yeah.
working on. That's an interesting point. I've definitely heard that before from content designers because for product design, you have a lot of these artifacts and visuals that you're constantly sharing.
Yeah.
What have you tried with like content design to be able to get over that hurdle?
It's difficult, Pavi, but one thing that I've tried, in fact, it just happened today. That's so funny that you mention it. For example, there's a new joinee, right? He's a lead UX designer, for example, and he's looking at the project, right, on the whole, and he has a lot to learn. He's constantly looking at the wireframes, and he's asking me questions about copy. And wireframes always have placeholder copy,
Yeah.
unless you're on a project where it's very important to present wireframes with near complete copy.
Mm-hmm.
So he's constantly been looking at it. And what I did was I just got him on a call and I told him, look, I'll give you a walkthrough of the copy deck. So that way you have a better idea of what's happening. So I took him through all the 4 packages and I told him, this is what we're doing. And his point of reference, right? The desktop version of the project. And I'm working on the mobile version of the project. And I had to explain to him that because the desktop version was the bit that we started out with, the mobile version follows the desktop version. So if you want us to stay true to it, we're always staying true to it. And then he understood that most of it, and he's making that mistake of looking at the wireframes again and again instead of because the wireframe changes are happening. And so he actually thought that things are probably getting missed out in the MCD. And I had to give him a walk through the copy deck. And then he understood and he was like, yeah, that Eureka moment. And I was like, okay, everything is covered. It's just that everyone's still looking at the wireframes.
Yeah, I know. I know that's always challenging. I think one of the things that I usually try always to do is to work very closely with content
Yeah.
designers. And I think for if there's a designer listening, this is probably something that's going to be
Yeah.
helpful to you, like working with them from the start,
Yeah.
because you can avoid a lot of these like confusions and then having
Yeah.
all these different ways of trying to find the information. You're ultimately building this one product. So I think
But
sometimes having
this is
that.
again, this is tricky, right? Probably because this chat is pretty candid, and when people see this, they probably I don't want to become a UX writer ever because what you just mentioned is so interesting because UX designers, 95% of them, brilliant. They understand what we bring to the table, content designers. But the way these projects are managed, right? They tend to come in before content designers. They start working 3 or 4
Yep.
weeks before content designers. So they just can't have content designers on board. The
That's
the
true.
the, the
Yeah.
project management doesn't allow them to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a change that
Yeah.
needs to happen
Yeah.
because yeah, there's a lot of context is lost because you're not bringing in the people who have the context in earlier. I want to shift gears a little bit because I was just
Yeah.
thinking about it as we were chatting. Let's talk about applications because I know like you had like conversations with someone from TD before you made the shift. But in terms of when you're applying for specific like UX writer
Yeah.
roles or content designer roles, how
Yeah.
does that process work? Do you have a portfolio or do you add things to your resume? Like what kind of things do you have to prepare for that?
Right off the bat, I'll admit I have a terrible portfolio, but yeah, a portfolio really helps because for a UX writer, right, I feel like the portfolio does a lot of the talking. One is your portfolio, and two is your resume and cover letter. I feel like I'm a sort of marketing manager for Monster or Indeed, but your resume is so important and a one pager. Just make sure that the resume is one pager because there's this temptation that you've probably got 10 years of experience and you want to do like this 2 3 pager. One page or even half a page, make it a slightly visual resume instead of
Mhm.
a Word document because you're now competing with probably some of the best content designers out there, especially in North America. Make sure your sort of personality comes through. Don't just list out job responsibilities in a very sorry hackneyed manner. Unfortunately or fortunately, you're a writer, so if your personality doesn't shine through or the way you write, then there's absolutely no point in that person. You're not piquing that person's interest.
Yeah.
And secondly, make sure everything is a story, even if it's a cover letter. Make sure that it almost comes across as a short story of sorts. Everyone loves a good story. The second way of doing it, which I like a lot, is reaching out and expanding your network. In Canada, again, this is very generic advice. Even if you're in supply chain management, people are going to tell you this. Instead of sending your resume out to hundreds of jobs, it's best that you network, because
Yeah.
if you get talking to the right person, like in my case, that you probably seen in the earlier part of this start of this video, you'll realize that when you talk to the right person, it makes a huge difference. A huge part of the battle has been won.
I love both these points. I think like two hot takes right here. I think that the first part about even just like crafting the way you've written
Yeah,
either like your cover letter, you talked about a story and showing your personality through
yeah,
writing is
yeah,
very interesting because I know as designers, you try to do that by designing your resume,
yeah,
designing your portfolio, because that's where
yeah,
your personality shows. So I love this perspective of showing
yeah,
that through writing and I think
yeah.
getting creative about that. Um, I have Ayush's bio,
It's
so definitely take a look at that bio. It's probably one of the most interesting bios that we've had so far.
it's just an FYI. It's risky the way I do it because I'm pretty humorous as a person. That's what I think. Sorry, you could obviously read that bio and say it's shit. But I recently got this advice that a person said that your resume is actually pretty humorous. It could go either way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And to end things off, if you have a piece of advice you'd want any person who's like either looking to get into content design or who's interested in it, what would that be?
Don't take my job from me. But yeah, I would say work on your craft. Things read a lot. It sounds more like a fatherly advice. I have a 4-month-old at home, so it sounds like it's fatherly advice. Read a lot when you write stuff, right? Even if you're creating a portfolio, think of different ways you could argue your case. If someone were to turn around and say, "Why does the CTA, for example, in your portfolio look like this?" Learn the art of arguing. What I do, I tend to do is I write down a lot of notes. You could buy an iPad, or you could just go to the dollar store and buy a notebook for $2. But pages of arguments. Why you? That's one of the key things that I tell you, because when you become a UX writer, you'll become a lawyer of sorts. You'll become a semi-lawyer of sorts, and you'll be arguing a case all the time. And
Mhm.
because language is so broad, right? It's a tough argument. There's a great chance you'll lose arguments and you'll give in. But once you practice a lot, there's a great chance you'll win most arguments. Secret, I still lose most arguments.
I think that's a great takeaway. And I honestly think for anyone within the craft of being able to rationalize like the decisions that you're making and why you're making them. And
Yeah.
sometimes you're able to go back and validate certain decisions that you had made like throughout the process. So I think that's a really nice exercise to do. Thank you so much, Ayush. This was really great and refreshing for me.
Yeah.
And I'm sure this will be helpful for anyone that's listening. So thank you.